18 seasons. That's how long the show Criminal Minds has been on CBS. So clearly, people are fascinated with FBI profilers, criminal behavior, the science that goes into catching criminals through the psychological analysis, right? I mean, to have a show last 18 years, clearly it's found an audience. And if you're a fan of that show, you've probably watched that and thought, I'd love to talk to or listen to a profiler walk through how they arrive at developing the criminal profile. So we did that today. We're doing that for you here on Deviant. We're sitting down with a gentleman by the name of Michael Yoder, who spent years in the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. You know it as the BAU. And we asked him to dispel some of the myths that shows like Criminal Minds have, because it's not going to shock you to know that some things you see on the TV show are not the way they are done in real life, but some of them are too. So we asked him, yes, there are myths. What are those? But we also said, hey, what are some of the things that are real, that really do occur just like they do on the television show? So with that said, today's Deviant Summer School, how a criminal profiler works at the FBI with Michael Yoder. Here it is. Enjoy the show. Michael Yoder, thanks for being with us today. You are a former agent, supervisory special agent with the FBI. And I think what is interesting and what is fascinating about your work at the FBI, and part of the reason why we're talking to you today and having you here, is being a part of the famed Behavioral Analysis Unit, which I think a lot of people know from the various Criminal Minds TV shows and the criminal profilings that we see in movies and then Hollywood.
Sure.
And I'd love if we can start with some of the myths. What do people not understand about the BAU that you understand, having been inside of it for so long?
I think the biggest myth is that people don't understand what criminal profiling is, and they almost liken it to us looking into a crystal ball and to find the answers, so that we are able to instantly come up with answers as to who did the crime. That's probably the furthest from the truth. Actually, criminal profiling, the procedures and techniques are very in-depth, lengthy, complex, and involved. It took me a long time to get to the Behavioral Analysis Unit. I spent my entire FBI career working violent crimes. So the precursor to getting the promotion to go to BAU was that I worked violent crimes. I also took a lot of classes on homicide investigations and homicide investigative techniques to learn the craft, and so that I could apply that as I understood and studied the behavioral perspective and threw that into the total analysis.
So let's go to sort of the beginning. And we actually had the other week, we spoke to a homicide detective who spent his whole career in Chicago. And he talked a lot about the process of investigating a homicide. And obviously he was with the local police department, but you guys were federal, obviously. So you're brought in to work certain cases. Can you take us to the beginning of when Agent Yoder gets the file on a case, how you get the file? Just take us to sort of the day one of when that all starts.
Okay. Well, first of all, homicide or murder actually is a state crime. So it's not a federal crime unless it's done against a federal officer, like a judge, for example. So it's initially conducted by local or state police. Right. They look at it first, and then as they get into the case, they invite us into it. It could be either an invitation to generically to the BAU or an invitation to me specifically from past experiences with them that I'm brought into the case. So it's invitation only that we're brought in, and we stay as long as we are wanted. So we'd like to stay for the whole case. We'd like to stay until completion, and completion means not only identifying the offender, but also prosecuting the offender. And we can provide a variety of skills all the way up to prosecution as to how to help them. And then we just stay with it. So on a typical case, I get a phone call or an email or some type of communication from a local or state investigator saying that they have this case. Okay, tell me about the case. So I get a general overview of the case. So from that, I want to make sure that it fits our parameters as to looking at the case. The next step would be for them to send all of their case material to me. And that's either through email, regular mail, or whatever else. Or it could
let me stop you real quick before you get too far, because you mentioned that it meets your parameters.
Mm-hmm.
Are there specific boxes that need to be checked, parameters that need to be met, or is it sort of a case by case? And that to sound like,
It's case by case. So an example of one that would not fit the parameters, perhaps, would be if the detective said that the victim died as a result of a drive-by shooting in a major metropolitan city.
Right. Okay.
So there's not a whole lot of behavior in there to dive into, and the suspect pool is going to be huge. So we might want to look further or ask more questions before we decide that we want to dive into something like that. However, if it's a case where it's a single homicide, where the offender is unknown, that's something that would pique our interest, because one of the ways we look at single homicides are that it's could be one of many, or it could be singular, a standalone as a single homicide. In other words, one offender committed one homicide with one victim. We use those to try to solve those because it could link us into other homicides, possibly. And that takes us to what we're known for, which is working on serial cases. But a serial case is really, in its simplest form, it's a single homicide multiplied, right? So and the way we look at a serial case is we look at each homicide separately. So it could be where we think, or we have some type of inclination that 5 victims were killed by a single offender, for example, over a period of time. Well, we'll try to find out who the first victim is, the first crime, and start looking at the behavioral aspects of it, start looking at it from a homicide investigative perspective, put those two together, and then we look at the second homicide and the third and the fourth and the fifth. And then we're looking at what's called linkage. What is it that makes these cases similar? Why is it that the investigators think that these cases are committed by the same offender? It could be something very scientific like DNA. It could be that there's a DNA match. It's unknown, but it's the same DNA in all 5 cases. Or it could be behavioral. In the crime scene, offenders may do the same thing that link all these 5 cases. We call that ritualistic behavior, where they, for whatever reason, it's only known by them, they've got to do a certain thing in that crime as a signature so that they can claim ownership over that crime. And that's what links these 5 crimes together. So we do a variety of single homicides. We also look at serial homicides as part of our go-to, or the cases that we're most interested. We also do sexual assaults, serial sexual assaults, adult kidnappings, a variety of missing and abducted children cases, and so on. So all in the violent crime realm, but we try to take those cases that a local or state investigator needs help on.
To sort of circle back, you're talking about when the case starts to kind of get to you. Mm-hmm. It checks those boxes, meets those parameters. The local agency sends you or gets in touch with you and lets you know, here's everything we have, right? Correct. And so take me from there, kind of how these things advance.
So the majority of the cases that I worked were done in that fashion, where they would send me material. I would review it over maybe days, weeks of time to try to analyze it fully. But the other part of this is sometimes we make the decision to go on scene, to actually go to the location so that we can get eyes on the location and get a different perspective of of what happened. So that's also part of the decision-making process, whether to go out there or to work at it in the comfort of our offices, basically. So once we make that decision, we communicate that to the detectives, and then we move forward. So again, profiling, it's not instantaneous. It's not something we can do in a snap. We look at the homicide. We look at all the crime scene photos, all the reports, the investigative reports, the forensic reports, anything pertaining to the crime. Witness statements. We look at what's called victimology, which is trying to understand who the victim is. And then we put that all together, try to come up with a profile. Now, what the profile is we don't come out and say, okay, it's Johnny Jones, who lives on Main Street. What we do is we look at the behavioral side of who the person is. So, for example, we could possibly say this person has a lot of rage against women, uses that rage to go after a type of woman. For example, a lot of victims are women, and may display this type of personality either at work or with other loved ones when he's not committing the crime of murder. And so we try to put together enough information behaviorally so that the investigators can go through their list, because they probably have interviewed that person or come across that person in their investigation. So they comb through their material, find a person or persons who are closely matched to our behavior, and then dial in to those people to see if they can be ruled in or ruled out.
We've learned so far that unlike the TV show, you do not fly on a private jet to the location, right?
Correct.
There's nobody that says we're wheels up in 30 minutes.
Well, I've got a caveat to that, but I'll let you know.
Okay. Well, we'll circle back to that. But I wanted to know, when you're putting a profile together, like if the profile is the pie, what are their different slices? Because again, and I don't want to constantly go back to like what we see in the movies on TV, but like we hear things about their intelligence, their upbringing, their relationships, their job, and so if you can't just kind of give me some insight about what are the pieces of the pie that you as the profiler are putting into the pie.
Okay. So some of the things we would consider is age of the person, and we would give a fairly broad range of the age of a person. And the mentality behind that is that these type of crimes are very physically demanding, so it would take a younger person to commit them. And again, that's case specific, based on the crime scene, based on what happened to the victim in that crime. Another one would be the type of job that they would do. So how we look at that is the person outgoing, friendly when he's not committing crimes? Can he turn that switch on and off between murdering somebody and working and having work relationships? And so what kind of job would give somebody who's, for example, not very communicative with other people, who's not very social with other people? That's probably somebody who works alone, who doesn't interact with people on a day-to-day, minute-by-minute basis. And so that could be one of the considerations. And then we look for a variety of type jobs that may fit that criteria, again, based on the crime, and based on the area, and based on what we know about the case. So those are two. Sex, gender would be another one. Was this crime committed by a male or a female, and why we think that? And so it has to do with different emotions, different strengths, the relationship of the victim to a potential offender. So we look at that. One of the things we do not look at, and we made this decision as a group in the BAU way before I got there, but we don't look at race as a criteria. And the reason why is because that race is not something that changes a person's behavior. Culture does, but not race. And so, we have gone away from that to say, for example, a white male committed this crime, or a black male committed this crime, and so on. And that's also part of some of the blowback from what people know as racial profiling, which is not criminal profiling. It's really the exact opposite. So we don't use race, but we use culture, and we use as a consideration. So where affluence comes into effect is, do we think the person lived in a lower socioeconomic environment, or did the person live in a middle class environment or in an affluent social environment? That plays into how they may have committed the crime and why they committed the crime. So, and to kind of circle back to the whole racial thing, is you can have an affluent African-American male living in a very affluent community in a suburb of a major metropolitan city, and that person thinks, acts, and operates differently than someone who lives in a urban, lower socioeconomic environment where they had to scrap and scrape for every dime and dollar that they own. And so the motivation may be different. The racial part just doesn't coincide with our behavioral analysis.
I mean, we all know it to some degree, but the idea that every single thing in our daily life in some way it has some bearing on the way we behave.
Correct.
And I think, obviously we are, a lot of us don't even think about it, right? But you have to sort of engineer all of those factors, those hundreds of factors, into how people behave.
Correct. So with that, what we believe is that when a person commits a crime, unless he's a 100% psychopath, the crime of murder, it's a highly emotional, highly stressful event. And you can look back on your life, or anybody can look back on their own lives. When you're in a highly stressful environment, you may do things that are rote memorization for your body. You may do something as inconsequential as straighten up pencils on your desk to make them aligned, if you are somebody who does that in their calm. So what you do while you're calm can be reflected in the crime scene itself under stressful situations, because you don't even think about those things. They're almost as a point of reflex, and they're automated, but they show up. So to somebody who comes upon the crime scene, an investigator or ourselves, we see a crime scene and we see things done a certain way that has no bearing on the crime itself. We ask ourselves, why? Why was that done? Why was that blanket folded up after the fact? Different things like that. Why was the clothes put away? Why were the pencils aligned on the desk when everything else was in a complete chaotic display? And that tells us a little bit about the offender. And that's part of the crime scene analysis.
You make an interesting point about asking why, right? Why things are the way they are at a scene. And I've had conversations with, police investigators who sometimes are skeptical a bit about the behavioral analysis unit and what they do.
Right.
And I've also talked to people who love it and think that it is 1000%. It's a fantastic tool. And I'm curious, from your standpoint, when you're looking at a crime scene and sort of asking why, what happens when the answer is just, it may not be sort of like a larger indicator of something, right? It may just be a thing that occurs. And the reason I said what I said earlier is that I've talked to people who oftentimes are skeptical because they think sometimes value is put in things that doesn't necessarily warrant the value. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I jokingly call BAU the why squad. So we ask why, which is different than a lot of investigators. For example, before I came to BAU, I had a colleague who was he was a SWAT guy. He was all into putting away the offender, finding the criminal and solving the crime and arresting somebody, and that's it. Once that was done, that's it. And I would always ask him, well, why did that person act that way? Why did that person commit the crime in the way he did? And he would always laugh at me as like, oh, you're the why guy. And so we do. We ask why. And to answer your question specifically, when you don't think that there is an answer, one, we don't always get the answer to the why. It may be beyond the scope of our knowledge or the scope of the information that we're ever going to gather on a particular case. And so, you have to learn to be okay with not getting all the answers to all your questions. And I would say that about any investigation. You're never going to know 100% everything that happened in a particular crime. And so that's part of the frustration of being a criminal investigator. But especially so if you're asking the question, why? I personally believe that there is an answer to the why question. And that I think we kind of give up when we say, well, there's no rhyme or reason, it just happened. I think there is a rhyme or reason as to something that happened, but we just don't know the answer. And we're never going to get to the answer. It doesn't mean that there isn't an answer. That's kind of my take on that. And as far as the whole, skeptics of the profiling process, I would say about 90% of the agents in the FBI are skeptics of the process.
Really?
Yes, it's that high. There would be, I had colleagues who would think that what I was doing was, as I was trying to get to BAU, and I worked in the Atlanta division, that, they thought criminal profiling was crystal ball, was magical, was nonsensical. So if it's 90% in the FBI, it's probably even higher in the general law enforcement community. But here's what I know. Having worked in BAU for 8 years, I saw it work. I saw it become effective. I saw it solve crimes. We don't solve crimes by ourselves. And that's part of that's a beauty, I think, of the BAUs. We don't take credit for solving crimes. We act as consultants. We, as advisors to others, to the local and state investigators, we help them solve crimes. And I have seen that our input has helped them solve crimes. And so I'm a believer of the process and the program. And I think if you apply it correctly, it's going to lead to a solution. And if that solution is just one person being found, then I'd say it's worth it. But I've seen many, many cases where we have solved a case. We have helped local and state investigators solve cases through the use of our profiling and our input.
I'm going to go back to working through a case. So, you guys get the information from local authorities and you start building out, you're reading through the files and what evidence and scene tells you. And, I've spoken to police oftentimes and detectives who say the crime scene always tells a story, right? And it's almost as if your job is to look at the story and figure out who the main character is, where you have everything else except for who is the main character here. As you're sifting through that stuff, is there sort of like a period where you're like, okay, we've gone through everything, we've read all the files, we've studied the scene, now it's time for us to sit with local law enforcement and kind of walk through our 15 bullet points that we've built out with the profile? Or is that an ongoing dialogue?
It's an ongoing dialogue. That's another thing that's kind of Hollywood with, Criminal Minds, the show, where they spend the first 15 minutes looking at the case, and then all of a sudden, and it's almost part of their mechanical script, let's gather the troops, and let's get them together. And then each member of the profiling team that's on scene, and it's almost like they're picking up on each other's sentences, will go through a verbal profile.
Right.
That doesn't happen, after 15 minutes of analysis. I would say that I've spent months on a case analyzing it. And it's not like it's dead silence between myself and the person I'm working with on the other end. It's ongoing. It's continuous, back and forth, going over ideas, asking questions, trying to get answers. It's interactive. It's ongoing. And so there may be a time where we come up with a written profile, and I'm more of a fan of a written profile versus a verbal profile, because we're verbally profiling the entire process. But when we put ink to paper, we're putting our names and reputations on the line. So there are times when we write up a written profile, give that to them, and then with what we believe some directions to the offender, some recommendations, some investigative recommendations. Also, we include what we can do in the future, how we can help them. So there are many different things that we can do at BAU. Everything from a interview strategy of somebody that they suspect. We do a personality assessment, which is different than a criminal profile of the person, to prosecutive strategies. Once they have somebody, they've arrested them, they're preparing for prosecution. How is it best to display that information so that jury gets it? So we also provide that. A lot of different skill sets in between that we can provide different services to the investigator.
It's science, right? And just as important in science is what you can prove, and just as important is what you don't know, right?
Yeah, a lot of people would say that it's not a science, that it's more of an art, because there's nothing, for example, criminal profiling is not evidentiary. It's nothing that can be brought out in a trial, for example. It's a pointer.
But if you're using psychology, right? Well, I guess psychology, you're not, it's more
behavior.
than just using psychology. Yeah, right.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's actually another myth with profiling, is because, just real quickly, I know you want to
sure
something
no
else.
Go for it.
A lot of students who want to study criminal profiling, they go to college, they see a program called criminal profiling in something that they can select, and so they select that and then they study that. And I would say that they shouldn't waste their time and their money to do that, because they're not studying criminal profiling. Okay, they are studying. There's a London-based type program that is empirically based. In other words, the premise is that they take, for example, 500 cases of similar nature, and then they try to boil it down to the similarities, and then they write about it and publish a paper and all that. That's more scientific, because that's using a scientific method. Criminal profiling, and that's we call that inductive reasoning. Criminal profiling is deductive. We look at each case singularly, and we use our experience. We use the research that is already out there, and we use other cases, but it could be a handful of cases to solve our cases. And we use deductive reasoning, and that would be more like a Sherlock Holmes type example. So that's why what I learned is not science. It's more of an art form.
Over the years of looking at all of these cases, and this isn't just specific to the BAU, I mean, police detectives have this too, but you develop patterns, right? Like you learn and you understand that there are patterns in the way people behave and the way people do things that help you understand or get closer to figuring out who the guilty party is.
Right.
How important is it during your investigation to straddle, here's what I know, and here are the patterns that I have learned about how people operate, but also every single case presents its own unique set of characteristics. And just when you think it's going to fit into a certain pattern, it could be completely opposite of that. How important is it to sort of straddle? It's almost like a vigilance, right? Like you don't want to get in too complacent with like, oh, well, it's this, this, and this, which means it's this guy.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It does. And part of that is just keeping an open mind, knowing that, everybody is a little bit different. Now, the opposite to that is we're not as different as a lot of people think. We're not so individualistic and so unique that what we do is nobody else has ever done that before. And that's been proven time and time again through empirical research, through seeing patterns, through seeing, offender behavior do things. And that's where we can use that to almost be predictive of behavior, of offender behavior. So a lot of that is conducting our own research, staying on top of what's being provided in the academia world as far as their research, and seeing how it fits in, but knowing that it's not going to fit in to a T. It's not going to be perfect. There are going to be anomalies. There are going to be oddities that we have to explain or accept as part of the investigation. So, that's where every case isn't a cookie cutter. Every case doesn't conform to the research, perfectly. And we have to be able to adjust to that, be open to and to be flexible to consider other options. And so,
Yeah.
it's a constant process. And again, it goes back to, are we really doing due diligence to the case? Are we looking at it with a fresh set of eyes? Are we looking at beyond what a homicide detective would look at it? Or are we just going to go with the flow? So that
Yeah.
groupthink can happen not just with my own colleagues, but just in the environment of the case itself, to where we accept a case. One real quick example of that.
Yeah.
I had a case that was about 12 years old, and the detective offered up his theory on the case right off the bat. So I took that in, and thank you very much. And then I started looking at the case. And one of the things that I put into the case that wasn't considered, because this was an investigator who had just gotten the case a couple of years before he had presented it to me, so he wasn't the original investigator, was that technology had changed. When this case happened, landline telephones were the thing. And there were no cell phones. And, I remember living through that time. I remember living through the pager era.
Yeah.
And so I looked at it as, this group of people, how could they have collaborated and formulated a plan to murder this victim without the use of a cell phone? Because they didn't have it. And I came to the conclusion that every person that the detective had theorized had committed the crime, a group crime, were not involved. And I could show through the very compressed time period that they were not involved, nor did they have the time to get together. And so they could not have committed the crime. And so when we took that out, when we took out his theory, then we were left with, well, who did? Because somebody did. And then we came out with new suspects. And ultimately we came out with solving the crime of who committed the murder. And, a different way of looking at it, making sure that we're in the right time era is actually one of the aspects of it.
Michael, this has been a really, really enlightening conversation. I think that a lot of people will take some real interesting facts away from our chat, because there's a lot of things that people think about what the BIU does and what BIU agents do. And there is the reality, which is oftentimes not the same. And so I found this really interesting. So I really, really appreciate you giving us some time today.
I appreciate talking to you.
So there is a big difference between what you see on TV and the reality of the work that FBI profilers do inside the behavioral analysis unit. I hope you got some value out of this conversation. We really enjoyed talking to Agent Yoder, so we thank him for his time here on Deviant Summer School. We hope you're enjoying these episodes. We're having a good time putting these together, so we feel like there's some value and some really good knowledge to be passed along. So thanks again for listening. As always, you can follow us on our social media accounts on TikTok and on Instagram at deviant.podcast. And of course, you can always join our Patreon community. It's at deviantpodcast.com. Starts at free. Everybody loves free. So thanks again for all of that and for all of you who have already joined. Deviant is written and produced by me, Andrew Iden, as well as Dan Semitovich, and is executive produced by me, Dan, and Clark Goldband, who is also our story editor and booker. Production and sales support from our good friends at Gemini 13, and original music and scoring provided by Shuvo Sir. Deviant is a production of Cold Open Media.